should not be interfered with in the schools. My name is Dolores Cahill, molecular biologist and immunologist. 15 years I've been a professor. For 10 years I was on the Government Advisory Science Council. It is psychologically damaging. The doctors know it, the teachers know it, the civil servants know it, and it is actually going to cause depression and anxiety to a generation. So what they're doing is making the elderly have more illness and symptoms and more death and more fear. It's entirely preventable. To the children, they are instilling fear, forcing social distancing. Masks are entirely unnecessary. They are going to undermine their mental health for a generation, cause them unnecessary anxiety. It is totally a crime against the children and a crime against humanity, a crime against the elderly. No. Truth and freedom. No, we are not having it. No, 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 no.
Welcome back to another edition of Not on TV, and there is a lot to go through, so let's get right into it. Here's a report from the NFL. They retested more than 70 tests which previously were positive, and all those tests came back negative.
Season. You know, that's 3% of the current active players in the league right now. That's a big number. And Dan, referenced, a couple thousand tests a day by this company. Well, how many tests were at this lab? Were there 100? Because if 77 positive tests, that's a pretty big deal. Were there 500? It obviously changes the picture. I think there's a lot we don't know that the league hopefully is sharing with the union in terms of the actual facts of that. And so
this obviously relates to the Football League in America, but the implications for these kind of companies doing tests which public decisions and health decisions are being made on are incredible. They're huge. And in my previous videos, we've talked at length about how inaccurate these tests are. We're still getting public policy being made on these decisions. At what point are policymakers going to actually stop and look at the inaccuracy of testing? Here's another report from August 24th in the Times. Coronavirus infection rate is down to immunity. And the headline reads, Sweden is beating many European countries in the fight against new coronavirus infections, possibly because of its decision not to implement tough lockdown measures. As cases surge across Europe, leading to new restrictions such as mandatory wearing of masks in public areas, the infection rate in Sweden is falling. And note it says as cases surge across Europe. Cases just mean positive results and nothing else. This word does not mean that people are sick. This is a report from the Irish Examiner. Laws to enter private homes and break up house parties are not due until next year. And on the face of it, it sounds, fairly innocent. But one of the things that has been very obvious to me for months and months is the laws that are being put in place around the world, which severely impact our freedom and our liberty. And the Examiner talks about these proposals, which will require very careful and detailed consideration. I think with how some policies have been forced into place in places like Melbourne and even in America and Ireland, I remain very skeptical when I see reports that careful consideration is going to be given to these types of things. I just think that our liberties are getting taken from us at a drastic rate, and citizens all around the world should be very concerned. Here's a headline from Children's Health Defense, and it reads, COVID response is all cost and no benefit, and it sums things up quite nicely. In the middle, it talks about an unprecedented, unscientific experiment, and we don't have any science to justify lockdowns or social distancing. And this paragraph, again, sums things up well. Global data now illustrate countries with full lockdowns not only have massive economic collateral damage, but deaths from COVID in many cases are higher than countries with minimal to no lockdowns. And we can see some incredible measures being taken in New Zealand right now, and it flies in the face of the data which we have. These French researchers have done some great work looking at what is called all-cause mortality over quite an extensive range. And I'm going to scroll through the summary here. And we can see the following. They talk about winter burden deaths, and specifically here they say, we are certain that this COVID peak is artificial, and they give the reasons why. Because it occurs sharply in a 1 month width at an unprecedented location in the seasonal cycle of all-cause mortality centered at the end of March. It was absent in many other jurisdictions. In other words, 34 of the USA states had no COVID peak, and it varies widely in magnitude from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in which it occurs. And they suggest that the unprecedented strict mass quarantine and isolation of both the sick and healthy elderly people together and separately killed many of them. That the quarantine and isolation is the cause of the COVID peak event, and that the medical mechanism is mainly via psychological stress and social isolation of individuals with health vulnerabilities. Essentially, putting sick people into nursing homes and isolating other sick people and even healthy people is causing unnecessary deaths, especially in the cohort in France, which they looked at. And here is one of the people responsible for relocating thousands of sick people to nursing homes in New York, Andrew Cuomo. And now he is mandating no dancing, no darts, no karaoke. He's banned comedy shows. And again, while all this may sound fairly innocent on the face of it, all these businesses involve the livelihoods of people who have worked their whole lives to establish their businesses to help their families. New York has had one of the most thriving places where you had small shops and restaurants, bars, small businesses in the world. And this source of income and happiness and community has been and is being absolutely devastated. The collateral damage and the fallout in relation to depression, anxiety, assault, suicidality, etc., it's almost incalculable. Why are we not hearing about this? But around the world, people are waking up, and this is one demonstration which happened fairly recently in Minsk in Belarus. As I reported in my last video, that these huge demonstrations are either not being covered in the mainstream media or they are being hugely underreported. So, for example, there was a march in Germany quite recently with what was estimated as 1.2 to 3 million people in Berlin. It was reported as a few thousand. A question is, are there treatments and cures? Well, why not listen to people who are much more qualified to talk about that than I am?
Steve Hatfill is a veteran virologist, and he recently wrote, there are now 53 studies that show positive results of hydroxychloroquine in COVID infections. There are 14 global studies that show neutral or negative results, and 10 of them were patients in very late stages of COVID-19, where no antiviral drug can be expected to have much effect. Of the remaining 4 studies, 2 come from the same University of Minnesota author. The other 2 are from the faulty Brazil paper, which should be retracted, and the fake Lancet paper, which was. What is going on here? This is very bizarre. And then I have this. An article written by Harvey Risch, who is a professor of epidemiology, Yale School of Public Health, author of over 300 peer-reviewed publications. And he writes in part, I'm usually accustomed to advocating for positions within the mainstream of medicine. So I've been flummoxed to find that in the midst of a crisis, I'm fighting for a treatment that the data fully support, but which, for reasons having nothing to do with a correct understanding of the science, has been pushed to the sidelines. As a result, tens of thousands of patients with COVID-19 are dying unnecessarily. Fortunately, the situation can be reversed easily and quickly. So you read this as a non-medical expert, as a non-scientist, as a non-professor, and you go, what in the world is going on here? The president is promoting it. We see some doctors promoting it. They're blown off Twitter. They're
I'm good. Nice to be here.
blown off Twitter. They're considered kooks. And here we have this top Yale professor who says, wait a minute, that's not true. Professor Risch, how are you, sir?
I'm good. Nice to be here.
The question is, you've looked, I take it, at all these studies, and what do you conclude?
I conclude the evidence is overwhelming. There's no question that in the people who need to be treated and are treated early, it has a very substantial benefit in reducing risk of hospitalization or mortality. And there's been a massive disinformation campaign that stretches from the government to the media that's either suppressing this message or it's countering it with a false message.
I often look at the Daily Mail to get a sentiment of kind of what's happening in the mainstream news, and it's fascinating for me to see the almost schizophrenic reporting. We do see some headlines slipping through every so often, and this one jumps out. NHS managers, the National Health System in England, told care homes to put a blanket do not resuscitate orders on all residents at the height of the COVID crisis. And we have a Professor Alison Leary who is investigating that. So essentially what that means is that at the height of the COVID crisis, and I have alluded to this before in especially some of my other social media stuff, at the height of the COVID crisis, do not resuscitate orders were put on older people in care homes. Essentially, if they had events where they could have been resuscitated, they were left to die. And these deaths were included in COVID figures. Even taking these deaths into account with the figures that were given about COVID, it is still less lethal than some influenzas that have gone prior to it. And yet I hear nobody talking about this. In fact, most people don't even realize that these things are going on. And we have this care home residents revealed at the start of the UK's outbreak that they had been urged to sign forms agreeing they wouldn't go to hospital if they caught COVID-19. So everything's been diagnosed as COVID-19. And we have people, again, who possibly had treatable conditions that they thought might have been COVID, and maybe they're avoiding hospital, and as a result of avoiding necessary hospital treatment, maybe they're dying. And in fact, people are reporting that this actually has happened. I'm not a mathematician, but this graph correlates a little bit with what I gather are the figures. And somebody put this together about how this is information from the CDC. And as opposed to the scaremongering and the fearmongering that we're getting, this is a summary of possibly how things should be reported. We can see here 47 million tests. The total negative tests were around the 43 million mark, which means that 90% of these tests were negative. The positive tests were 4.3 million, so that's a positive rate of 9.24%. Of those, we are saying there is 140,000 deaths, more or less, which means that out of that 9.2%, 3.2% of those deaths were positive, and that percentage of the total tests is 0.3. And these are US figures. So to extrapolate the total tests into the population of the US, which is 330 odd million, that means there's a mortality rate of 0.04%. And if we include ages into this mortality rate, when we drop down to an age of 45 or under, the mortality rate is just about 0. Can anybody in the comments tell me how this amounts to a pandemic, please? And here we have a German study confirming that 81% of pre-COVID blood donors show a T-cell reaction against SARS-CoV-2. Okay, so the T-cell reaction is an immune response which supposedly shows you're protected. And what this study is pointing out is that samples were taken from blood donors before this so-called epidemic, and about 80% of people are protected. In fact, 81% of people. And this is to unexposed individuals. When we think that 20% of all common colds are coronaviruses, one of the assumptions is that by having a cold or a flu previously, that you have a T-cell antibody response which protects you from other coronaviruses. There's a suggestion that the point of the study is to show that a low level of T-cell response isn't immunity, but then we can throw out the question of how come we're seeing so-called asymptomatic positive tests. A few people quite rightly point out that it's fairly incredible that we have to test for a deadly illness. Think about that, testing for a deadly illness. You would think that if the illness is deadly, we don't maybe need a test for it.
Go and research masks for yourself and just throw out anything from 2020. Then go research masks again and only look at things in 2020 and you'll get very different results.
It's a phenomenal point. Yeah. What are the psychological implications of children wearing masks? Because when I was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, saw 5-year-olds wearing these masks and they looked miserable and they looked confused. And I say this very, confidently. I'm so glad I didn't grow up in America where I had to grow up with a mask on. What are the implications of this?
Well, aside from the fact that they're absolutely useless and that kids won't abide by putting them on, which sort of renders the whole point moot, they are actually psychologically damaging. They instill and reinforce fear. I keep getting back to this point about fear because I think it's really the crux of this entire issue right now. Without managing the fear, we cannot move forward. I see dozens of children every week, about a quarter of whom don't wear masks. Parents appropriately dissuade them from using them. About half of the kids are sort of on and off the mask, and about a quarter are on the mask all the time. What I've noticed is that in families that insist that their children wear masks or that limit their children's activities to activities that require masks, which is actually quite common now in Los Angeles. Kids are not allowed to play with one another, they're not allowed to bike, they're not allowed to go to the park. A private park in my neighborhood where I live was just closed 4 days ago because the homeowners association noticed that there were, this is their bulletin by the way that I'm quoting, too many children not wearing masks in the park, and that the grass might become contaminated, and that because children like to touch the grass and roll in it, they could become infected and then kill their grandparents that they're living with. So they sprayed toxic chemicals.
Another example of some underreporting by the media about a demonstration that happened in Ireland, which was reported at a few hundred people, and it was much closer to a few thousand people. But one of the doctors presenting there had some very interesting comments to make, Dr. De Bruin.
Well, I'm a microbiologist. Before I studied medicine at the College of Surgeons, and I'm a general practitioner at the minute. And what do you think of the government's policy to make masks mandatory? Well, the government's policy has been effectively dismissed by the government itself in two ways. The COVID-19 committee in the Oireachtas, in the Dáil, commissioned an independent expert from the UK, from Oxford University, who has pointed out to the government, their department has pointed out clearly that masks are a total waste of time and dangerous in terms of cloth masks. So that information was already presented to the COVID committee, but they called Minister Donnelly to appear before them, but he dismissed them and wouldn't bother going. Well, it's a very important smokescreen for the manslaughter and the neglect that led to so many deaths in the nursing homes. Micheál Martin, one of his first acts of when he became Taoiseach, was to state quite clearly to the Irish people, with Ryan Tubridy on the Late Late Show, that there will be no public inquiry. So, you know, this process of masks and herding us down this road is essentially a very sophisticated smokescreen to keep people talking about things like masks, which is what we're doing, and not talking about the horrible neglect and the failures and the people who have missed cancer screenings, breast cancer, cervical cancer screening. In order to keep us looking at those things and keep us away from a public inquiry, away from a look back, we'll have to look forward and have a dialogue about masks, which is fundamentally ludicrous.
Is anybody worrying about mandatory vaccinations for especially their children for a disease that doesn't kill children and basically doesn't kill young adults? You should be. This headline: Virginia plans mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations for all residents. Bear in mind that these vaccinations are being rushed out at light speed. They're not going through animal testing. They are using different sorts of experimental technology, and the companies developing the vaccinations are not exposed to any liability associated with problems from these vaccinations. Some people have broken down this report from the CDC recently. They estimate, based on these figures, that the COVID deaths, and we know that they're falsely elevated, are 352 within a certain time period, and in that same time period the deaths associated with the lockdown are 488. People seem to be blinded by this narrative of, if we can only save one person, a life is a life. Yes, older people, we need to protect them. What about the protection for the people whose lives are being destroyed because of lockdown policies? The information is all around us. Another headline from the Telegraph: coronavirus hospital admissions inflated at the height of the pandemic. Analysis from SAGE concludes people were being counted as COVID-19 admissions if they had ever had the disease. So in other words, if they tested positive at any time and they were admitted to hospital, regardless of whether it was for a COVID-related reason or not, they were included in the COVID statistics. And of course, we know the testing is grossly inaccurate. Here's a graph about masks in Miami. So the mandate, as we can see here, was instructed in around this time, and quite a while later we can see that cases are spiking. So we can't have it every way. If we're meant to believe the figures that we're being given, then we can see here that masks are totally useless. And Miami had very strict mandates on wearing masks, and still does. And as we get blasted with fear of new cases, and we are being coerced into thinking that there is a pandemic going on, we see a report from the CDC which announces a doubling in suicidal ideation and a tripling in anxiety, and depression among children is quadrupling. These kind of reports are horrendous, and they're just not getting the exposure they deserve. And quickly back to Virginia, they have just introduced some legislation that is recommending the treatment of a particular drug, and I'll just point it out here, should be used in the treatment of COVID. Bear in mind that this is the drug that has been banned throughout many places in the world, and as also a drug that has been used for decades and decades to treat conditions like malaria and neuropathy in all sorts of people, pregnant women, older people, etc., etc. Another headline which is very relevant: mothers could transfer lifelong protection against infection to their children by breastfeeding, reveals a remarkable study on mice. So immunity was found to be passed on in white blood cells rather than antibodies. We know now from years and years of research that we have to have boosters and repeated vaccines because we lose immunity relating to vaccines, but breastfeeding can give lifelong immunity. When you start looking at something called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and you start looking at policies which have been prepared by organizations like the World Economic Forum since the early 1900s, all the way through to the end of last century and through to the beginning of this century, things begin to look rather sinister. And a common theme is this theme of a great reset and having, I guess, ultimate control over humanity and what they do and when they do it. And when we look at some of the draconian measures being put in place in relation to more and more street cameras, places getting locked down, signing in, signing out, registering here, registering there, this kind of evolution fits very well within the plans laid out for decades.
Has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system for the need for the post-corona era.
The Great Reset is a welcome recognition that this human tragedy must be a wake-up call. As you rightly say, it is imperative that we reimagine, rebuild, redesign, reinvigorate, and rebalance our world.
These are unprecedented times. Every person on the planet has been impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. Our world came to a standstill, and it became clear that we did not have the answer or the mechanisms to address such an unprecedented global threat. We have a golden opportunity to seize something good from this crisis. Its unprecedented shockwaves may well make people more receptive to big visions of change. Global crises like pandemics and climate change know no borders and highlight just how interdependent we are as one people sharing one planet.
History would look at this crisis as the great opportunity for reset. Secondly, we know the digital economy is the big winner of this crisis.
We have a choice to remain passive, which would lead to the amplification of many of the trends we see today: polarization, nationalism, racism, ultimately increased social unrest and conflicts. But we have another choice. We can build a new social contract, particularly integrating the next generation. We can change our behavior to be in harmony with nature again. And we can make sure that the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution are best utilized to provide us with better lives.
I find it really concerning that we are being told blatantly that this pandemic will be used as a reason for a great reset. And from CNBC, scientists warn it may be years before students can return to school without masks or social distancing. Again, another example of schizophrenic media. I thought that we are being told that vaccinations can return us to a new normal, and then we also have scientists telling us that things aren't going to change for years and years. At what point are we going to have to be skeptical and ask questions about the so-called science? We hear this, follow the science, and when you actually look into the science, it is more propaganda and sponsored than actual valid research. This is an open letter penned to Dr. Fauci about the treatment that we've discussed already, and It's a very long letter. And if you are interested in more of the science behind this, I would really encourage you to read this. The people who are writing this letter are very, very well qualified. And the questions behind this letter are very, very to the point, and they pose all the questions which we should be asking. They also highlight the blatant hypocrisy and some of the maybe financial reasons why this treatment is being demonized. There are great points in here about the so-called safety of this very safe drug versus the safety of other treatments which are being proposed, which are not tried and tested. Here's a very interesting interview on Spanish television with this doctor is just describing things from his experience and from science and research, yet the reporters are in some way trying to trap him and push their own narrative, and they didn't get very far. For the purposes of those who are just listening to this, I will do a little bit of a commentary on this interview. It starts with a female reporter asking the doctor if he's worried about an imminent influx of patients, and asks him if hospitals are going to be increasing their bed levels. And while she asks this, he looks very skeptical and shakes his head a lot. He says that he doesn't know what hospitals she's talking about, and states that yes, it is true they're seeing an increase in the number of admissions, and relates that to the fact that admissions had dropped off significantly beforehand, and any kind of increases would be seen as an increase. He states that 75 people were admitted in a hospital with 1,300 beds and 540 tested positive. Then he poses the question, are these sick or just positive cases? And then describes, because the data can deceive and confuse us. In the health centres, we administer only PCR tests, so we will find many positives. We classify these positive PCR tests as COVID-19, even though they are only people who have just been tested in their cars. So we are creating confusion by announcing COVID-19 cases are increasing. There is an increase, but not for patients who have a pathology of COVID-19. A pathology of COVID-19 is what we saw in the spring when our hospitals were indeed crowded. But at present, we see an increase in cases that are the simple result of an increase in PCR testing. And having a positive PCR test does not necessarily mean that we are sick. She then talks about a book called Coronavirus, The Search for a Vaccine, and mentions the possible vaccines coming out of Russia and Germany, with all eyes that are focused on it. And his reply is, well, of course, it's always profitable to talk about a vaccine, especially after having made sure the fear to believe it is necessary, because we need to sell it. The question is whether we need the vaccine. Is it safe and without danger, and is it effective? But first and foremost, is it necessary or not? If it's true that the contagion has already affected a great mass of people, why is it necessary to vaccinate the whole population? Look at the numbers of infections of Helicobacter pylori. It is present in 50% of the Spanish population. That, by the way, is a stomach bacteria. And he points out that nobody is worried about 50% of the population having this, but they are about this COVID. When she asked him about staff that are returning, his response was that measures have been put in place to confine everybody in September by making them believe that they have behaved irresponsibly during the summer. So he's referring to the lockdown there. He says strategically it works, but we don't believe it's right or practical from a medical point of view. And then says, of course, we do not expect another wave. And then very directly points out it would have been nice in the spring if the press had talked about overflowing hospitals, because we were really overrun, and describes putting patients into hotels because they had exceeded the capacity. And it again points out in springtime was when they needed to talk about hospitals being overflowing. He points out, before there was a pandemic, you didn't speak about it as you should have. Now that there is no pandemic, you talk about it all the time. Sincerely, I don't understand. Somebody says, we've lost control of the interview, haven't we? And then a male interviewer jumps in to try and rescue the situation by saying, your intervention arouses controversy. And he's interrupted by the male reporter saying, excuse me, we've done nothing but talk about the numbers 24 hours a day in the media. The interview finishes with a rather embarrassed reporter being told that when the hospital was actually overcrowded, they should have been talking about things back then, and now they are basically fear-mongering and suggesting things which are not correct, and they should be looking at the actual real data more closely. Now I'm starting to see a good few reports about this, which is very intriguing. When we do the PCR test, we have what's called a primer, which locks onto a little piece of RNA. Now, once it locks on, we can identify that specific piece of RNA. But it seems that when we look at data from the World Health Organization, the primer kind of reflects the RNA which it's meant to lock on into, but it is identical to a piece of human DNA. This sequence is found on chromosome 8. It matches identically what we're calling COVID. So some people are suggesting that the PCR test is quite simply just amplifying our own DNA. It's much more complex than that, but again, there are people who are doing lots of good work about it. There's a Dr. Andrew Kaufman who does a great explanation about this, and I suggest you have a listen to this. But the important thing is for you to be aware of this information, to know that things like this are out there and these questions should be answered. I think people have to listen to alternate voices in relation to things like vaccinations. Here's a report from Sky News.
Yeah, Greg Hunt was on this show yesterday saying, well, maybe it's towards the back end of next year. That's a pretty wide time frame, and maybe even that's ambitious.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing is with the Oxford vaccine and a few other candidate vaccines that are in the final stages, the phase 3 stages of testing. There are at least 2 of them, including the Oxford vaccine, where the phase 3 studies may be finished by the end of the year. And if that's the case, and then they're peer-reviewed and published, that may be the start of next year. And if it works, then we have to manufacture it. So I would have thought we're looking at quite a few months, so probably the middle of next year.
Middle of next year. That's if it's successful. You might get the vaccine and then figure out that that one actually doesn't work that well, and you need follow-up shots, you need booster shots. And, you know, what did it take polio 4 years to get the proper vaccine?
No, exactly. And even with some of the studies now, with some of the vaccine candidates, they're giving the first dose on day 0 and giving a second dose at day 28. And that's why it's so important that we keep our options open with the vaccines, because the first vaccine to come out may not be the most successful. It might only give us a year's immunity.
And just to remind everybody, this was from a mainstream television channel called Sunrise in Australia in around March, with predictions for a mild pandemic, 21,000 deaths. For a severe one, 53,000, and a worst case, 96, nearly 100,000 deaths. And these were the things that were bombarding people around the country. Can I remind you that the actual figure now is something around that 400 mark, and there's a question mark even about many of those being actually COVID deaths. That means people dying with COVID as opposed to from it. And we have Melbourne and Victoria being put into lockdown because of this.
Mortality? Not necessarily. So for deaths from coronavirus, anyone who's a confirmed case who dies is classified amongst coronavirus deaths. So it doesn't have to be definitively from coronavirus. And in some instances, in aged care, there would have been some residents who were already receiving palliative care who became infected with coronavirus. So it's not definitive about whether they've died with or from coronavirus. I think it's fair to say that coronavirus is a very serious infection in anyone in aged care. But for classification purposes and reporting purposes, that's the definition.
So I want you to be really clear here on what this guy's saying. What he's saying is that many of the deaths were in people who were palliative. Palliative means they were going to die. Those people who were going to die anyway, if they were recorded as having COVID, they are included in the numbers. So it's irrelevant whether they died because of the disease or with it. And bear in mind, the guidelines given to doctors meant that tests weren't necessarily required. it can be subjective. So if a doctor thinks that maybe this person had COVID, that was good enough. So again, it's another example of the fact that the figures that we are using have to be grossly, grossly inaccurate.
The second part of your question is what proportion of asymptomatic individuals actually transmit? We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases, they're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare. And much of that is not published in the literature. From the papers that are published, there is one that came out from Singapore, looking at a long-term care facility. There are some household transmission studies where you follow individuals over time and you look at the proportion of those that transmit onwards. We are constantly looking at this data and we're trying to get more information from countries to truly answer this question. It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward. But from the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmits onward to a secondary individual.
So that's just a reminder what the World Health Organization had to say a few months back. And now we're getting a lot of different reports that are correlating these reports of spreading from asymptomatic people. We can't walk into a store without getting attacked by hand sanitizers. Before you willingly rush to throw this stuff all over your hands, have a quick look at this headline. FDA announces new deadly toxin found in hand sanitizers, adding to recalls. One of these is called propanol. And then here's a list of some of those hand sanitizers that are being identified as dangerous. The list goes on and on. We talk about liberty and losses of freedoms and our human rights. And as citizens, are we really going to accept things like this?
Police are preparing to launch their aerial arsenal as part of a crackdown on COVID rule breakers. High-powered drones will be used to find people not wearing masks and cars too far from home.
Not that I really have anything to hide, but quite simply just the thought of this happening in around our country is something that I find it very difficult to comprehend, especially when you add up all the pieces of information that I've given up to this point, and we are going to accept this kind of martial law. And bear in mind all this for something which is less lethal than previous flus and colds. People in Victoria, people in New Zealand, people in different places around America should maybe be paying more attention to articles like this. This headline reads, "Why America Should Adopt the Sweden Model on COVID-19." If we use Sweden as the control group, Sweden in actual fact appears to have fared better without a lockdown than many places who mandated lockdowns. Even a little line in there reads, "For all intents and purposes, or for all practical purposes, the COVID-19 epidemic is over in Sweden. Almost certainly herd immunity has been achieved." Here, Dr. Eli David breaks down figures and does a comparison between Peru and Sweden. Peru had some of the strictest lockdown rules. As he states here, lockdowns don't work. How many additional refutations do we need for people to stop suggesting the use of lockdowns? Let's talk about the pandemic of empty hospitals. I've discussed this before. And finally, it's becoming too big even for the mainstream newspapers to ignore it. This headline reads, "My hospital has become a medical Marie Celeste. As NHS waiting lists rocket while appointments are limited, one doctor tells of his frustration." He's a Dr. Rod Hughes, and he describes his hospital as being more like ghost town. This report, incidentally, is coming out of the UK, but people all around the world are reporting similar things. So we come to that question, why would all this stuff be going on? And the Rolling Stone has a very interesting headline. "Big Pharma's COVID-19 profiteers. How the race to develop treatments and a vaccine will create a historic windfall for the industry, and everyone else will pay the price." One of the drugs being touted is a thing called remdesivir, and as it says here, at $4,500 per dose of treatment, the people who are going to make this company called Gilead announced a price well below that level. It caused a tremor on Wall Street and its share price fell. And when we look at some of the figures, 500,000 doses were bought by Trump in September. We have information that up to 500,000 doses have been bought by the US of this remdesivir at around $4,000 a pop. And if we extrapolate the price of future vaccines that should be delivered, as Bill Gates would say, to everybody in the world, the profits are mind-boggling. An article from CBS News reports the following. Moderna CEO, Moderna happens to be one of the companies in the forefront of trying to produce a vaccine, and Moderna CEO and other executives made millions on vaccine announcement. So these guys basically are doing a form of insider trading. They have lots of shares and financial interests in the companies that they're in, and these shares are floated on the stock market. And we can see here that based on just announcements, share prices can jump up to 30%. Here, at this stage here, they got an all-time high of $87. And one day's stock sales generated $1.2 million for the CEO. Is there any way we can have any sort of balance in the reports that we're hearing from these companies when we have these kind of profits that are being offered to the people in charge? More headlines. People are waking up, but there is a massive bias in the type of reporting that we're getting. So the Mirror reports huge anti-mask crowd protesters against lockdown restriction and 5G phone networks. While some people were possibly talking about 5G phone networks and mask coverings, there was a lot more going on. The thing that was being contested most was the actual lockdown and the, I guess, deprivation of liberty. And these kind of headlines seem to put a conspiracy theorist kind of twist on anybody who wants to question that mainstream narrative. The other thing I'd note is that anti-mask carries that same kind of expression as anti-vax. And this propaganda, which is used to intimidate people from asking any sorts of valid questions about things like vaccinations and about masks. I've yet to see any valid science about the use of masks and how they present viruses. If you know of it, please put it in the comments below and I'll have a look at this. So this kind of discriminatory term of anti-mask is absolute rubbish. And if you do have questions and if you do have doubts, ignore this, because this is just, as far as I'm concerned, bullshit propaganda to keep people quiet. There are a lot more people who have serious concerns about what is going on all around the world. And I think that these concerns are valid. Here's some footage from a recent protest in South Korea, which was This report was described as millions of people protesting, and they included things like restrictions and mandates on wearing of masks, etc. Often satire is a great way of reporting some kind of messages, and I really like what this girl here has done.
Against Broadway and Midtown bar and restaurant owners who happen to be his vocal critics. None of it makes much sense unless you factor that into the messed up equation. Does it make sense to force restaurants to close at 10 p.m.? Is coronavirus more contagious after 10 p.m.? Does live music and social distance tables transmit COVID any worse than the freaking strip club a mile down the street that's allowed to be open till 3 a.m. Monday through Thursday and till 5 a.m. Friday and Saturday? Because I think the hell not. Take that in for a moment. Let that marinate. A strip club is allowed to be open, but local bars, many of them iconic bars that built this town, have to be shuttered.
And then we get companies like SAGE, which is the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, putting out statements like this. A substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. The perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. Do you think that this is what we're seeing? I'm not sufficiently personally threatened. and I refuse to let fear-mongering impact on my life, especially when I have dug deeply into what's going on and the fear is not validated. The reasons for the fear are not valid. And when you think it can't get any more absurd, you see headlines like this coming through. US developing coronavirus strain for human challenge trials. A few things jump out to me about this. Why would you need to be developing a strain of coronavirus when apparently it's everywhere and people are dropping over and dying with it? And are we not kind of worried about manipulating artificially these strains, and if they're getting out? And we had all this information about Wuhan viruses coming out and man-made viruses and whatnot. Should strains of this virus be developed man-made, well then how the hell can a vaccine that's used in relation to those trials be effective against a natural form of the virus? There are so many things that just don't make sense about some of the things that are happening around the world in relation to this. One of the things that does make sense is the massive financial motive behind keeping everybody in fear and then selling numerous drugs to people all around the world.
If you presumably still are the Commissioner of Health when a vaccine is made available to the public, do you intend on mandating it?
Yes.
Commissioner of Health Dr. Norman Oliver says he strongly opposes a bill that would allow people with a religious opposition to opt out of an otherwise required COVID-19 vaccine.
It's killing people. The overwhelming majority of people would, in fact, respond well.
A new poll suggests more than 1 in 3 Americans aren't interested in getting a coronavirus vaccine.
More about masks from the New England Journal of Medicine, no less. We know that wearing a mask outside healthcare facilities offers little, if any, protection from infection. Public health authorities define a significant exposure to COVID-19 as face-to-face contact within 6 feet with a patient with symptomatic COVID-19 that is sustained for at least a few minutes, and some say more than 10 minutes to even 30. The chance of catching COVID-19 from a passing interaction in a public space is therefore minimal. In many cases, a desire for widespread masking is a reflexive reaction to anxiety over the pandemic. We know that our health experts and our governments are aware of these things. The problem is that the people and the population in general are not aware of these things, so we need to be sharing this information with as many people as possible. Remember, our governments are meant to work for us, not the other way around. This is more from a Professor Luke O'Neill in Ireland about masks.
Worth a damn. They are if you're infected. That's
if you're the infected
one
person.
Yeah, the number one advice is it'll stop you cough. If I cough on you, couldn't I? Yeah. Face mask would trap the virus in the face mask. If you're not infected, no reason to wear a face mask. 2 reasons. One, people fidget with it anyway, you know. And secondly, it goes in through the eyes as well. It's an evil virus. It'll penetrate the eyes, and that's not covered anyway, you know. So there's no evidence that wearing a face mask will protect you at all.
And maybe it's time for you to start asking, why are the increase in cases being screamed at you? New cases rising, etc., etc. And then you have headlines like this, which just seem to go past without any focus or scrutiny. This one is from The Guardian. The government quietly drops 1.3 million COVID tests from the England tally. And this is due to double counting, and it raises questions about the accuracy of testing figures. The information is everywhere about how inaccurate the figures we are using are. So the figure was lowered by about 10%. An adjustment of 1,300,000 has been made to the historic data for the tests made available metric. And they've been made as a result of more accurate data collection and reporting than previously adopted within Pillar 2. So there was a double counting of test kits that had been dispatched. I mean, if this kind of stuff is not enough to make people wake up and be furious about what's going on, I'm not too sure what is. And we'll end with a reporter from Australia, Alan Jones, who's finally delivering a counter-narrative to the rubbish that we're getting fed. And my sentiments very closely echo what Mr. Jones has to say.
Everywhere I go, and I mean everywhere, the constant refrain I get is that people are sick and tired of dictatorial politicians promoting a climate of fear and alarmism over coronavirus, but they never cite the figures which prove they're either ignorant or duplicitous. You can't have it both ways. They either can't read or they can't tell the truth. Today, Daniel Andrews seems unhappy with the decline in numbers, so he's ordered more testing in regional areas where there are no COVID cases. You get it? Looking for new numbers. Gladys Berejiklian is the high priestess of alarmism, and I know for a fact large numbers of her party and her cabinet, that is on the rare occasions they meet, are fed up with this stuff. Now, I've got these figures here. Where are they? In front of me. World Health figures, and they're clear. They're clear. I card it with me. Somewhere here I've got them. And I card it with me wherever I go. There we are. World Health figures. And it tells us they're there. 6.3 million infected patients. The serious or critical around the world, front page, 64,000. The rest, 99%, unless these dumb politicians don't understand numbers, the rest are mild. In Australia, it's cost us $360 billion so far for 361 million deaths. For 361 deaths. $1 billion per life. And in all of Australia, 25 million people, 51 are critical, 43 of them in Victoria, 8 in the rest of Australia. Critical. 8. 634 in hospital in Australia. 619 in Victoria. 15 in the rest of Australia. 15, and this is a pandemic? Is there a politician with the spine to tell Australia the truth? And here they are contemplating lockdowns. More threats from Gladys Berejiklian, bars and cafes. Haven't we crushed business enough? Lockdowns. Well, if lockdowns worked, why is there a problem in Victoria? The Lancet Medical Journal, let me repeat, is an independent international medical journal dating back to 1823. A world leader in the publication of papers that have made a crucial contribution to science and human health. The Lancet recently argued, and I quote, "In our analysis, full lockdowns and widespread COVID testing were not associated with reductions in the number of critical cases and overall mortality." This is political vandalism. The global death toll from coronavirus is around 750,000. It's not even the 20th deadly killer in the world. In 6 months, the death toll in Australia is 361. But the average daily death toll in this country, daily, every day, 432. Yet Melbourne is effectively under martial law, masquerading as medical law. This is public policy insanity. And mark my words, coronaphobia will kill more than the coronavirus. And on the lockdowns, let me tell you this. No lockdowns in Sweden, population 10 million, deaths 5,600. New York City, massive lockdowns, population 8 million, deaths 32,000 with 2 million fewer people than Sweden. New Jersey, population 9 million, 1 million fewer than Sweden, deaths 16,000, 3 times as many as Sweden. Massachusetts, population 6.9 million, 3 million fewer than Sweden. Coronavirus deaths, 8,300, 1.5 times that of Sweden. Yet here in Australia, we've smashed the economy, destroyed the livelihoods of good people. And what have we got to show for it? Nothing, except alarmist and hysterical politicians who seem incapable of researching for themselves and calmly presenting the electorate with the facts. Which prompts the question, are they seduced by polls? Now they're talking about coronavirus elections. Well, bring it on. There are some of us who won't tire of reminding the electorate of the catastrophe these politicians have created. The voiceless need a voice.